Hello, everyone. This is Hanney, and today we are going to talk about your favorite topic, morality. And who is better to talk to us about morality than Dr. Richard Carrier? Hello, Richard. How are you? You're muted.
Got it.
I always,
Yes, no, I'm doing well. Thank you.
I always fall for the same thing. I always mute myself when I first start the program. Morality. This is a conversation that I don't think it's going to ever end. I mean, we always talk about it, but we're quite kind of vague about it. I'd like to start with some definitions to get us up and running. Morality and ethics. I mean, these two words have been sort of used interchangeably sometimes, used in different contexts. I know that the Greek words mores and ethos have something to do, but if you can take us through the definitions of what's the difference between the two.
I don't like the trend to try and make them different. There isn't really any etymological basis for making them different things. Ethics is just the Greek philosophical word. Moralis is actually Latin. So it's just a difference of Greek and Latin. There is really no actual. I know some people have tried to make a difference between them, but there's really none. So I don't make that distinction. But if you ask, like, what is moral? What do we mean by moral? It's a good question because you ask, well, what are we actually looking for? And I think a lot of people skip that step. Like, they forget, like, what is it we're looking for, really? And then they just make a presumption, but that might not necessarily be a shared presumption between everybody in the conversation, right? Some people might say, well, the moral is how I want other people to behave, right? It's like, that's our goal. And so that doesn't really work because that's not really persuasive. You're not going to persuade anybody to agree with you on that. So the real, when I've done it, I've gone through this and looked at what does the moral usually mean most of the time in most countries, most cultures, most traditions, and most philosophies, most religions. And the one thing that it does mean that in common to them all is that which you ought to do above all else. Quite simply, it's an imperative. It's a list of imperatives. These are the things that you ought to do over any other things. So if there's anything that you ought to do more, that has to be classified as a moral thing. There can't be anything that you do more than morality. Morality is, by definition, whatever it is the thing that we ought most to do. And so that's what morality is, basically the imperatives that supersede all other imperatives. That's what we're looking for. It's like, is there a set of such imperatives, and what is it? Is basically the question that everybody's going for. And even if they're being disingenuous or superstitious about it, like religions pushing a certain morality, they're still saying the same thing. They're saying you ought to behave this way over all other behavioral options and choices available to you. They just don't have anything to back it up. So it's like David Hume said, like, his priests go around saying you ought to do this and you ought to do that, but they never give any evidences that that's true. And they can never even explain why it would ever be true. Like, what do they even mean by the word ought? For example, and so Hume like challenges them on that, but even Hume agrees that we're talking about the same things. Like, what is it that what is the behavior that ought to supersede all other behaviors? What should we be doing? How should we be conducting ourselves?
Yeah, when I was examining the two terms myself, and I think this is my sort of what I got from it, and I could be wrong. We lost Dr. Carrier, and hopefully he will be with us in a second. Here we go. He is back.
Sorry, I vanished there.
That's right. I was doing my own sort of study around the. Your audience is back. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah, okay.
When I was doing my examination of the two words, ethos and ethics and morality, and all the schools of ethics and morality, I'm thinking here they all agree around the same sort of general idea, but where the emphasis in the process and the source has been put, that changes the school. So for me, the word ethos comes from character, and then maybe an indication that it's to do with your character as a person. And there are some schools of morality that puts that's the most important thing. It's about your character.
Yeah.
And morality comes from the word mores, which is customs and habits of a group, of a society. And then sort of that puts it back on a group of people and the conduct in a social environment rather, because morality means nothing if you are alone stranded on an island, I guess.
Yeah.
Or if you're a rock.
Right. Yeah. And there is true that we often do restrict what we mean by morality to conduct that affects other people. That doesn't really change the fact that there are also imperatives that supersede all other imperatives about how we should treat ourselves. But whether you call it moral or not is a semantic debate as to how we want to frame things for our discussion. But usually when people talk about morals, what they're most interested in is behavior that you're asking other people to engage in with respect to yourself, right? And so, or respect to your loved ones or whatever. So it's, yeah, you're right. There is often that limitation. But when you get to the difference between character and behavior, one of the things that Aristotle did was to show that you can't disentangle those, right? So like you're only going to habitually and thus reliably behave a certain way if you've cultivated certain virtues of character, right? So I think the science has to unify these two. You can't really, I know a lot of philosophers want to separate them, but you really can't in any practical sense. So I think all philosophies of morality end up being the same. They're talking about the same thing, but they're focusing on different aspects of it. And Aristotle focuses on the character, the virtue aspect of it. Immanuel Kant focused on the what sort of person do we become when we act. So he's looking at consequences upon the moral agent more than the consequences upon the world, although he's also incorporating those. And then you have the utilitarian, the consequentialists who are saying, well, it has to do with consequences. What action produces the best consequences? Then everybody has to argue over what constitutes the best consequences. And but these all end up being the same thing. I think it's just a question of debating which consequences are we talking about, and then which things do we have to do to actually engage in these behaviors that are supposedly moral. And I think when you answer those questions, you end up with everybody's right, and you find a sort of unification of all of them is where the true morality lies. And that's where I've written most of my moral philosophy, including my peer-reviewed moral philosophy. And also I have to give mention to Philip Foot, who developed the idea of hypothetical imperatives, that morality is just a system of hypothetical imperatives. And I think this is an important distinction. Maybe we can get into that later, but that has to do with Immanuel Kant trying to turn them into a different kind of imperative, a categorical imperative. People might have no idea what we're talking about. But it's an important discussion that actually sort of collapses a lot of debates in this once you really see the true picture there. Anyway, that's my immediate thoughts, but let's proceed.
I've noticed you've mentioned the word imperative quite a lot, and I was going to ask you, if somebody knocks on your door and asks about the whereabouts of your dog because they want to kill him, would you tell them the truth?
And see, that would be a debate where Kant would go, yes, you should never tell a lie. But you can actually show even from Kant's own system that that's wrong, that actually you should. So Kant said, like, morals should be whatever behavior that you would will to be universal. So if any behavior that you say that anybody can do it, but lying to save innocent life is something that you would will to be universal. I said, like, I'm totally fine with everybody in the world always lying to save an infant life, if that's the only thing you can do to save an innocent life. And so you actually can create a universal categorical imperative in which you may be dishonest, right? So even Kant didn't really apply his own theory thoroughly. And I think when you do, you end up discovering that all moral theories fully realized end up agreeing with what you should.
I've always scratched my head. Yeah, I've always scratched my head at this one because I think I'd argue it's the moral thing to do here is to lie.
Yeah, right. Yeah, and it comes from like this presumption that because you said lying is wrong, that therefore it must always be wrong. But actually, no, it's consequential. It's what do you want to call it? Circumstantial. Yeah. Like whether this, objectively in the sense of the mindless cosmos, there's no difference between lying or truth. So the question is, if lying is bad, you have to explain why it's bad. And when you do that, you're always referencing circumstances. You're always referencing situations. So when or whether lying is okay is always going to be situational. And so no one should be shocked or surprised by that, because you can't actually argue that anything is immoral or moral without referencing the circumstances.
Yeah, we were talking about a movie before we started our live session, and here's another movie for you. I'm not sure if you've seen it. Have you seen The Invention of Lying by Ricky Gervais?
I have seen that, yes.
That's brilliant. So this is a world where lying didn't exist, and now he's being sort of mischievous and is using lying in a fun way. But there comes the point where his mother was dying. Remember that bit? And she's talking about heaven and stuff like that, and she wants consoling. And he's used lying here because he was an atheist, you know. And he said, well, no, yeah, there's going to be heaven, and we're going to see each other, and we're going to be there, and you know. And he found that at that point, lying just to console another human being was the right thing to do.
Yeah, well, there's no benefit to telling the truth in that circumstance. Yeah, right. Which I think is one of the victories of philosophy in the modern era, is that we've pretty much agreed that consequentialism is the correct moral theory. Even modern Kantians have conceded that you can't formulate categorical imperatives without references to consequences. So I think that's just always true. And I think it's an important revelation, because that's how we build. We can't just ignore consequences. We actually have to like focus on those as really the whole purpose of why we're even discussing how we should or shouldn't behave.
Yeah. I think consequentialism and the argument from utility, that these two schools of thought are very similar to each other, apart from one difference. I think, though, correct me if I'm wrong, the one of the utilities, you've got to sort of sit the target before you even start, while consequentialism sort of leave it really open to the situation.
Yeah, there's a large variety of utilitarianisms. So, Mill's original formulation of it, and there are versions of it that weren't called that go back all the way to antiquity. But even today, there's, for example, desire utilitarianism, which is about the utility value of the specific desires that you're modifying your conduct according to, rather than the utility of the conduct itself. The utility of the conduct itself matters, but the real ultimate decision is there's a certain utility to what desires you have and don't have that motivate and cause behavior. So you can do a whole utilitarian calculation out of that. And maybe like the trend that's often associated with utilitarianism is trying to do this mathematically, right? Like trying to come up with some sort of mathematical equation for right and wrong. And we don't know anything with that amount of precision usually for that to be that useful. And usually what we have are, even you don't even have to do the math, where you know the difference between consequences is just so huge that you don't need to math it. Like it's obvious. It's only becomes an issue when there's a moral conundrum, like where you have two options, both suck, right? And they're both really close to each other in the negative consequences. And so that's becomes difficult to manage. And when you do look at those, that you find that the reason you can't solve them with math is because the problem is the imprecision of your knowledge of what's going to happen. And so if you were to just properly represent that in the math, you would be just as uncertain as you started with. So the math can't help you, basically, right? So that's an epistemic problem, not a measurement problem.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about it the other day. Most of our thinking about morality, it's black and white. You know, the choice between an act of goodness and an act of evil. But in practicality, it's always a 50 shades of gray. You could be looking at 50 different situations, like designing a Tesla model that is about, in an accident or collision situation and who to hit. It's horrible at the end of it. But then make a decision on that.
Many decisions always have negative outcomes. And so you're trying to decide what has the least negative outcome, right? And then there will often be a lot of superstitions about this that come from human psychology. And the trolley problem is an example of this, where the question of whether you act or don't act and allow a certain thing to happen. And people have a tendency to feel like if you do nothing, that somehow you're not responsible for what happens. But that's a superstition. In terms of objective analysis of what's happening, that is still a decision. You were literally choosing the outcome that happens without your intervention. And so you have to confront the moral reality of that you are actually making a moral decision by not intervening. and you are choosing the outcome. And so you are responsible for that outcome. And so you can't avoid it by saying, well, I'm refraining from action, therefore I'm immune to moral criticism. And there's a lot of like little psychological tricks that affect people's judgment like that, that we have to get past. We have to like study scientifically and admit our excuses, not legitimate reasons.
Were the ancient Greeks first to write about morality, or do we have evidence that this was written about longer before ancient Greeks?
Well, obviously, morality in the broader sense goes back to the prehistoric times, because you have it in religions. So all religions are talking about moralities and mores and customs and things like that. But if what you mean is a sort of logical analysis of what is right and wrong and why. Like, rather than just saying, well, the God said, saying, well, why is that right? Or why should we agree with God, right? So that's the serious, when you're actually looking at it, this is actually an epistemic problem. How do we answer this question? And you notice, like, it's usually the most cosmopolitan cultures that first notice this as a problem. So the Greeks are meeting, and you notice, like, Herodotus will write about how, well, we meet all these cultures and they all have different moralities. Well, how do we know which one is true, right? And then, of course, you get the philosophers come along and go, well, let's answer that question. How do we answer this question? And so I think the first people in the historical record that we have that survives who did start asking this question, why is any particular moral system right? What do we even mean by morality? What is the universal true morality? When they're doing it as an analytical question, trying to solve this question, is the Greeks. And we see it before Aristotle. The Greeks themselves thought Socrates was the first to actually start this debate. There's some evidence that there was a few philosophers before him who were already talking about it. Socrates is the first one who's the big, the guy who really made this an important central focus of philosophy. And then Aristotle, who's the tutor, or who's the student of Plato, who's the student of Socrates. Aristotle's the first to formalize it into, to really talk about how do we talk about this in an analytical way, as opposed to sort of the continental way that Plato did it, and Socrates apparently. So I would say, like, we're talking roughly the era of Socrates. So classical Greece is when this starts. We see a parallel trend in China. It comes a little bit later. So you get like Confucius and things like that about this, maybe roughly the same time. But when you look at, like, the real hardcore Confucian philosophers who are doing proper analytical philosophy, that's the Han Dynasty. And so now we're looking at, like, 1st century BC, 1st century AD. And 2nd century AD is that span of time is when they started hitting their stride and doing really good analytical philosophy of moral reasoning. And we have Sun Tzu. What are some others? Mao Tzu. There's some of these major philosophers who are doing these kinds of moral reasoning. Wang Chung was another who's done this, but even their stuff didn't get as sophisticated as it did in the West. So really, Greek philosophy is kind of like the cornerstone of everything.
So would you agree? Okay, maybe the ancient Greeks formalized it, but and this is going to have to come now to the definition of what is morality.
Right now,
wouldn't you agree that the first few humans who traded and who had rules of engagement or rules of conduct, what is the right thing to do, they're sort of accidentally stumbled upon morality and probably haven't written it down. It started that way.
In that sense, it predates humans.
Yeah.
Right. So we have evidence of moral cognition among apes, and so they can't, like, articulate this in terms of propositions. They can't do analytical philosophy about what they're doing, but they have their brain is engaging in moral calculus, and you can tell that they have some idea of how to assess what is moral and what is right and what is wrong. It might be hugely crude and unreliable, but there's some sort of trend there, and we can see it in the trend line towards the moralities that we develop later. So evolution is already sort of meandering its way towards true moral reasoning, but evolution is blind, so it's not it's not that intelligent. So it never nails anything perfectly. It's just like, I give this analogy in some of my works: human reason. Our brains evolved capacities for logic, but a sort of crude logic. It's not a very reliable logic, but it's more reliable than random chance, right? So, like, the brain, the mind of an ape is going to be more successful at figuring things out than the mind or brain of a fly or a worm, right? Or even a mouse. And then when we get to humans, we're even better at it, but we're still hugely flawed. If you look at the list of cognitive biases on Wikipedia, our brains are badly designed all over the place. But even the ones that you look at each one of them, they would have a statistically higher chance of success than random choice. So even though they have flaws and they're often erroneous, they're better than chance, which is why evolution selects for them. Now, later, humans realized that our native intelligence, our intuitions, and so on are hugely flawed. And so we started building tools to help us do better. So, like, that's when we get logic. That's when we get analytical philosophy. That's when we get scientific method. We realize if we apply these tools, we can correct for a lot of the biases and errors of our innate biological reasoning and do better. So we can see the trend line where the brain is going in terms of reasoning, and then we can build tools that do even better than evolution got to. And we did that with reason. So that's how we have today a massive civilization based on science and logic and mathematics. And I think the same is true of morality. You can see that trend line already with the primates before humans. You can see the trend line of where the brain is trying to get to sort of create sort of an ideal moral reasoning. Didn't get there, but it got close. And then we come up, just like we invented science and logic, we come up and invent moral philosophy to perfect what evolution didn't. And so we can do better than evolution now because we can do analytical philosophy. We can do empirical science to figure out what actually are the best judgments and behaviors for the things that we want in life.
Right. So then we could argue, and I'm not sure if you're in agreement here then, that almost nature, obviously not planned or anything, but we're talking about a brain that is taking 525 million years of developing. You live for quite some time with the ancient backside of the brain, the reptilian one, you get the middle one, and then suddenly 2 or 3 million years ago, you get the prefrontal lobe cortex, and the frontal lobe cortex, and you get the amygdala and areas of judgment. It's almost like the hardware is being sort of set up for the software to start operating.
Right.
Sense, is it a tool of survival? When you strip all the sophistication out of it, is it something that will help us survive better?
Ultimately, yes. And so what you described like really well, that's the description of how the brain sort of builds up. And what happens, you start with like the basal instincts, you get like lizard brain stuff. That performs better than not, right? It performs better than random chance, so it's useful. But then you get the mammalian brains, which are building all these emotional architecture on top of that. And that's these judgment systems that allow smarter judgments to be made and more quickly motivate behaviors. And so the brain's getting a little bit better. It still makes lots of errors. It's still not super reliable, but it's better. And then, of course, you get to humans and you've got, like you said, all these other advanced architecture that's actually what we call the rational brain. And that, of course, exists to put checks and balances on all the other stuff, because the other stuff can make mistakes, but a rational brain can step in and correct for those mistakes. And that gives us an even more advantage, because now we're even closer to reality in the way we can conform our behavior. We can navigate reality better because of this. And when we get to moral behavior and we look at the brain science, we have a lot of this. We studied the evolution of moral reasoning in the brain. And there were generally lots of areas participate in this, but there's two main sort of separate centers of the brain that do moral thinking. And one of them focuses on intentions. It asks, why did you do that? And by taking into account intentions, it allows you to like excuse accidents. So there's a judge who famously said that even a dog can tell the difference between being kicked and being tripped over, right? This is actually part, we can see that in the mammalian brain already, this part of this ability to tell the difference between intended harm and unintended harm. And so that's really important, because if you're going to be a social animal like humans are, we depend our survival advantages, all of them depend on cooperation, right? And so it's really important to be able to judge whether, like, how do you react to this other person doing a thing? Do you just like rain hell on earth on them, or do you go, oh, okay, that's not such a big deal?
It's almost like gauging intentions.
Yes, exactly. No, and this becomes crucial to having a successful cooperative society. And of course, you can't have civilization without this. So the only reason you and I are here on a thing called the internet discussing moral philosophy is because we evolved social animals with good architecture in the brain for navigating social relations, one of which is intention management. And the other side of the brain, of course, is justice, tit for tat measurement. So we have another part of the brain that only looks at consequences. It's like, you did something that hurt me, I'm going to hurt you back, right? Is the thinking. Now, the other part of the brain is supposed to like mediate that and say like, oh, no, wait, hold on. Because if you just go tit for tat, you're going to be wreaking havoc. You're going to have less cooperation. But if you have both centers of the brain as checks and balances against each other, you're not going to over forgive and you're not going to under forgive. And so you're going to have better regulated behavior and more cooperation in that society. And so, yeah, this benefits the human species because we benefit from cooperation, where we don't really rely on the individual's superiority or success. Human success is heavily and entirely dependent on pro-social behavior, on cooperation with other people. Yeah. That's what makes us more successful at everything than any other animal. And so morality is very much a tool for social cooperation. And in that sense, it's very important. The other part of morality, which I also want to emphasize, people need to know, it's also your internal well-being. So morality is very important to who you feel that you are. And do you like who you are or do you not like who you are? And this is very closely tied into, do you fit in a society? Can you be a pro-social person? And we evolved the architecture for this, the inclination that we want to be that kind of person. And there are certain exceptions. There are diseased minds, psychopathy, and so on, that we know a lot about. We could discuss scientifically, but they're aberrant and self-defeating. Like sociopaths don't do that well statistically. Even when they do well in sort of superficial measures, they suck at a lot of other things. Like they don't have good love lives. They don't have friendship. They don't have a lot of deep, a lot of deep satisfactions with life. They're often very dissatisfied and frustrated all the time. And so that's the other side of things. So it's both social system management. Can you get along with a society that behaves this way? And should you behave that way to sort of participate in society well? And also, what sort of person do you really want to be in the world? And are you realizing that, or are you defeating yourself or by acting contrary to that? And these do overlap. They coordinate together. And I think when we look for what is the moral truth, it is where those two things reside, where you can have nothing but true beliefs about yourself and still be completely comfortable with who you are. And you are able to operate in a culture and in a society effectively, and rather than self-defeating. And so that's where morality lies. And it does have that evolutionary basis. It doesn't completely come from evolution, but like I said, it's like reason. Like evolution got sort of reason right, but not quite. But we can come along and invent even some more superior tools of reasoning. We can also invent even more superior moralities than evolution got to. And we should do that. And we have done that. But I think people need to focus more on doing that rather than just looking at a book and the book says such and such, or my authority says such and such, and not engage critically with why do you even think what you're doing is actually the moral right thing to do.
Then obviously organized religions come to the scene, not necessarily the monotheistic ones, but even the polytheistic ones, because the whole thing started, maybe Epicurus has sort of talked about it, and they do what they always have done, hijack things that already have been there and claim it to be their own.
Yep. And this actually starts at the structure of law, right? So this actually begins, so you see Hammurabi's Code goes way back. The Old Testament, the laws of God, what we call the morality of the 10 Commandments, for example. And they're not really 10, by the way. There's like hundreds of them. But that's basically a sort of cheap knockoff of Hammurabi's Code. And it came later. Like it's a borrow. It's a lift. It's not even original. But Hammurabi's Code, but where it's a law, where you've got a king who wants to organize and order his society. And he gives a list of things that I think my society will run better if you follow these rules. But rather than try to explain that, he says, no, God said it right at the top. Says, God came down and gave me this stuff, so you better do it. And it was just sort of a cheap way to put authority behind what your plans and ideas were. And it would take a while until we get to Greek philosophy when that no longer worked. You couldn't just come in and say, well, God said something. And you go, well, let's argue about that.
So what?
I don't think it's true. Let's make your case. And so you get the first time when philosophy is all about this is rather than just believing myths, believing things that are handed down, you go, well, actually, we need to debate this, and you need to like present some evidence that what you're saying is true. And then we get philosophy, then we get science, then we get mathematics, and we get democracy, right? So it's all comes out of the same mindset. But like you said before that, it's in religions, but it starts with law, and then the conflation of law and morality sort of eventually happens sort of in Judaism, right? So there's no difference between law and morality, whereas there was in most other cultures. And so we get that from the Bible, this idea that the law is morality. And so moralistic religions are predominantly biblical religions. So that's Islam to Christianity, Judaism, Mormonism, and so on. When you look at like Hinduism, it's not like that, right? There's more of a sort of there's an ethical philosophy. There's a philosophy to morality, but it's not like God said, right? Mm-hmm. So it's more heavily superstitious. It's still more about like, well, karma, and if you behave a certain way, these are the outcomes, and so on. It's the same thing I'm saying, except they pump in a whole bunch of false superstitious beliefs about how the world works. So the morality comes out on the other side is completely wrong, right? You got to put true facts in to get true morals out, is the basic thing, the basic realization. But yeah, religion did end up co-opting this because religion ended up being a sort of control system altogether, really.
Yeah, well, it's always been argued that, well, it doesn't matter. I mean, if this is a sort of code of conduct that comes from outside of the of the group, where we have a social contract together, say, well, this is how we're going to behave together, because this is going to be the best way to survive as a community. We want to do the right thing by each other. But when it descends from heaven, especially with absolutely no explanation whatsoever of what's the grounding rules, and you got Saturday, you better not, or you'll be put to death. I think there was a guy who collected some sticks for fire.
Right.
And he was that's quite arbitrary.
Right. Yeah. And you notice that the morality has nothing whatsoever to do with the benefit of society. Like, no shrimp or you die. Eat shrimp and you die. Like, what's the point of that? There's no point of that. So a lot of this is, I mean, there might be a sort of Machiavellian point to it, and there might be a superstitious point to it, but there's not really a genuine factual point to it. And I think that's why moralities have evolved, so that even Christians today will claim that their modern morality, let's take the most liberal, actually the most morally practicing Christians today, they'll claim that they're following stuff in the Bible and say, no, you're not. You're following morals invented by secular guys in the Enlightenment.
Richard, the funniest comeback I've ever heard about the shrimp thing, there was a Muslim guy who said, well, there weren't any fridges then, and seafood poisoning was a thing, so God was waiting for fridges to come.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense, because all foods have potential poisoning. So you can get E. coli from vegetables. So it's like that theory never made sense to me. Also, neither did the pork thing. So there was often trichinosis. And it's, well, first of all, they didn't know there was a connection between trichinosis and pigs, because you get symptoms so much later after eating. And secondly, no, when you look at the history, the reason, well, a lot of these things come from Egypt, by the way. So they're sort of borrowing these morals from Egyptians to make them separate themselves from other Canaanites, right? So this is a way to separate themselves and make them basically their own unit that aren't cooperating with outsiders, right? It's a very insider-outsider kind of thing. It's a very hostile religion, really. But the idea that the Egyptians had this too. The Egyptians, before the Jews borrowed the idea of no pork, the Egyptians had no pork. But the Egyptian reasoning, and this is a good example, it didn't come from God, right? Their reasoning, they just had sort of this, it was craft lore, just knowledge you have of your world. And they said, well, we have pigs roaming the streets eating our trash and shit and stuff, right? That's what pigs are for, is they go through and they clean up our refuse in the streets. And so the idea is, ooh, who wants to eat pigs? They're full of shit, right? It was basically that kind of superstitious. Well, they're polluted by the offal that they're eating. Therefore, we would pollute our own bodies if we ate them.
And you don't want to eat your vacuum cleaners.
Well, I mean, that wasn't the argument, because you can always breed plenty, right? So that was never the problem. The problem was that it was this superstitious taboo. It was flesh taboo, which makes no scientific sense, but it's what they believed, and that's why they built a moral out of it. Now, all the Jews did, all the Israelites did, is borrow the same stupid superstition and claim God told it to them. And that was the only change that they made. There was no other legitimate basis for it. And so that's the way that morality evolved before we started doing proper empirical-based analytical philosophy or philosophical morality. And I think we need to be doing moral philosophy, not looking at holy books, because they're just full of superstitions, like pigs are bad. This is nonsense.
So while we are on the subject of divine command theory, I know that you've been engaging in a rebuttal or a sort of an opinion piece on our very own Justin Briley's. I think he's got a podcast called The Unbeliever.
So Justin Briley is a London Christian radio host, and he's run it's actually a really good show. He runs he's probably one of the best Christian interview shows that I can even think of. And he's run it for a really long time. I went on the show when I was in London, like over a decade ago. And you can watch them all. I think you can watch or listen to them all. I think they're audio. There's more on video now, but a lot of the old ones are still archived in audio. I think you can find them all online if you go to the Unbelievable podcast or the Unbelievable BBC show. And so, I followed his work for a while, and lots of people followed him because lots of people had the same opinion of him. And he's a really good host, and he's a good listener, and so on. And so, he's not a douchebag, right? He's actually a good guy and actually gives his guests time to say their piece and and challenges them, but challenges them in a good, friendly way. And so he's a good host. And so the question is like, he has all these atheists on his show talking about this stuff. How is he still a Christian, right? It's this big question. And so he wrote a book, and it came out recently. It's a few years ago, called, well, it opens with unbelievable ? And the subtitle is, how did a Christian interview atheists for 10 years and still stay a Christian? And so it's basically his defense of Christianity, why he's still a Christian. And so people have asked me for a while, like, you should do a critique of this book. And the reason they would say is because this should be like the best case for Christianity. And I went and read it, and I said, yeah, actually, this is an honest case for Christianity. I'm used to dealing with liars, Christian apologists who just lie all the time, and it's extremely frustrating. But this is a sincere defense of Christianity. It has a lot of false facts, has a lot of failures of logic, but they're sincere failures, right? He's not lying. He's not trying to run game on anybody. And so it's important to really interact with this book. And so I'm doing a series on it. I did a summary article, and then I'm going to do 5 other dedicated articles on specific arguments in the book. I've done 2 of those already, one of which I just dropped today, which is on what we're talking about here, which is moral theory. And more particularly the moral argument for God, because he says, well, morals prove the existence of God, which is an even further step of argument than morals depend on God. But to say that the evidence of morality as evidence for God, that's a whole other ball of wax.
Is he claiming them to be objective and therefore God? Okay, objective.
Yeah, of course. Brierley's not a really capable analytical philosopher, let's be fair. So it's difficult to act, like, he doesn't have syllogisms. He doesn't really lay out how he's getting from A to B. He just says, well, this is what I think and why. And then you have to kind of analyze it yourself and figure out what argument he's making. And when you do that, you find a lot of flaws in his reasoning, for sure. But you brought that up. Let's get back to that topic. What was the reason you brought Brierley's book up? Because of this.
So we're going to now examine divine command theory and how it is sort of ontologically incorrect. It can't be for various reasons.
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious because logically God could be a bright bastard. Right? So the mere fact that he's a god does not commend anything, he says. And so you still have to defend it. So even God would have to defend it. He said, well, here's why I'm right. Even God has to explain why he's right. Otherwise, there's no reason to believe he is. And so if God has to explain why he's right, we don't need God to exist to explain morality. Because once we can explain why God would be right to say X, then we know why it's right to say X. We don't need God to say it, right? Anymore. And like you were saying with divine command theory. Now, importantly, Brierley does not believe in divine command theory. But it's important because it is a problem, especially for highly conservative Christians that really depend on divine command theory. And of course, its main problem is it's the Euthyphro dilemma, right? Plato says, well, if God, is it good because God commands it, or does God command it because it's good? Now, if God commands us because it's good, then that means it's good independently of God. We don't need God. We can just use wisdom and find morality ourselves. Well, that can't be, right? So morality has to depend on God. So God can't be choosing these things because it's good. God's just making them good by commanding them. But well, then how do we know? There's no sense in which what he's commanding is good, because he's just making shit up. He's just being arbitrary. He has no basis for saying that those things are good. And
we have
no way out of this.
Yeah, we have evidence, Richard, that when God then commands something that is usually perceived to be horrible, like killing other nations, and suddenly it becomes the moral thing to do.
Well, slavery is the best one to use because there's just no defending it. And so, the Old Testament commands slavery. It commands genocidal sex slavery, which is literally the worst form of slavery possible. It commands it as a moral good. In God's words, in quotes, from God. And in the New Testament, it's never condemned. Slavery is never denounced, never said to be wrong. In fact, Jesus in the Gospels is depicted as using slavery as a moral model, justifying God's actions towards man. So he actually de facto completely endorses slavery as a proper relationship to have with someone. And so the Old Testament and New are completely pro-slavery. There's no anti-slavery in there, which is a decisive proof that Christianity is an immoral religion. It can't come from a moral God, right? So And this is a conundrum for Brierly, right? Is he wants to believe that God believes that slavery is immoral, and at the same time still believe that his God inspired the Old and New Testaments. And it's not possible. You can't reconcile those things at all. You either, if you pick one or the other, you either have to say slavery is moral, or you have to admit the Bible isn't about God. The Bible is a false religion, and that's you're kind of screwed on that measure. But the slavery is a good one to use because you can show how long it took for us to finally admit that this is immoral, and then what we had to do to actually argue that it was immoral. We really couldn't appeal to the Bible. When abolitionists appealed to the Bible, they would pick verses that kind of said things they wanted to say, and then would spin them for their argument. But that spin is the actual case for abolitionism, right? So the spin is not in the Bible. The spin is the stuff they added. And so that we actually had to start thinking like empirically. We had to start thinking in terms of the natural world and the nature of society and the nature of human beings and what sort of people we wanted to be. And once you do that, slavery becomes obviously immoral.
Because slavery is not just a case of compassion. You can actually have a very pragmatic and practical argument why, on the long run, it's for a nation to have slavery at some point. We know now in the U.S. it's always still going to haunt the U.S. That history is always sort of lingering. It's a horrible thing. It's actually sometimes stop you from actually doing the things you want to do, because you always have to look back and fix certain things that were done in the past, and you cannot undo them.
Yeah, that's also true. But just getting back to divine command theory, yeah, exactly. So like I use the example in my article today on Brierly's chapter of the Uganda lobby. And I don't know if a lot of people know about this. This is these evangelical Christians in America that had this kill the gays movement. They wanted to get homosexuality outlawed by execution. And they have hundreds of thousands of adherents in the United States. In the United States, hundreds of thousands. But hundreds of thousands doesn't beat 100 million. So they're not winning the votes. They weren't getting any leeway. They weren't getting the laws passed that they wanted. So they went to Uganda, where they knew that they could lobby the Christian Ugandan government to enact these laws. Because they said, here's somewhere in the world where we can actually enact God's law, enact God's command to kill gay men. And they did it. So they had the death penalty. Eventually, I think the death penalty was removed and turned into like life in prison or something. I don't know. It's still bad. They still really tried to argue for this. And what was their basis? Well, God commanded it. And you can't really argue with it because it's in the Bible. He commanded it. He did. Unless you think that wasn't God. And then that's a problem for Brierly, because there goes your religion. And so that's the thing, is like, what if God is commanding these horrible things? What if he's commanding mass rape, which he does in the Old Testament? Well, how do you respond to that? Like you have to be able to have some sort of argument by which you can say that what God is commanding is wrong. And it can't be because God commanded it, because he's commanding the opposite, right? So the divine command theory does not help you in terms of determining what's right and wrong. It does the opposite, really. It allows liars and tyrants and people with really bad ideas to push their ideas on society by saying God said it. No, you have to go like the Greeks and say, no, you got to make your case. So you got to show me evidence that this is the best way to live. If you don't, I have no reason to agree with you. And if you do, I don't need this God thing. Once you've given me evidence that this is the best way to live, then I have evidence that's the best way to live, and I'll be persuaded. And that's it. And I think that's the sort of key revelation there. But Brierly goes with the divine nature theory. So this is an attempt to get around the problem of divine command theory, is to claim that, well, God commands these things because in nature he's good. He couldn't command anything else, and that's why what he commands is good. But this just kicks the can down the road. Now you have to ask, like, well, why do we know God's nature is good? How do you know that? Like, what does that even mean? What evidence do you have that that's the case? What if it was in God's nature to command slavery and mass rape? It's like that. Divine nature does not get you out of the problem. It just moves the problem to another post. So that doesn't really work. And Brierly doesn't see that it doesn't work. He thinks that he's gotten rid of the problem, but he hasn't. With this, he's not done anything.
Especially as we know that most horrible people and psychopaths don't think of themselves as being immoral or evil. They're just acting based on their nature. So if you're acting based on your nature, thinking you're good, but you're not.
Yeah, exactly. God could be a total sociopath. And in fact, you would think statistically it's more likely that he would be. Because think about it, like God did not evolve in or grow up in a community. He's always just been alone and the boss of everybody, right? He's invincible, so he never has to cooperate with anybody. So why would he learn compassion or pro-sociology? Like why pro-sociality? Why would he learn those things? Why would he have those things? There's no reason why he would. In fact, you should be really afraid of an entity like this that has no experience, it was not built for societies whatsoever, has no experience with them whatsoever, no architecture for being pro-social and cooperative or compassionate. That would be terrifying being to encounter. So in that sense, it's good that we don't have that God, but that's not the God that Brierley believes in, right? He doesn't believe in a sociopathic God. He believes that there's this genuinely kind, loving God. And that's the problem, is that there's no evidence of that being the case. But the arguments still come down to just the evidence of reality. You don't need God to argue the case.
And that's I'm thinking of that kind of, actually, that's pretty much the Muslim God, because Muslims kind of got it right. They say, you better surrender. you got no say in the matter here. Don't think about it.
Yeah, but I've read some Islamic philosophy, and they will do the same thing, where they'll say, well, you should obey God because God knows best. Right? It's not just that, well, God is not governed by any morality. He can do whatever he wants. It's that, well, we just have to have faith that God has a moral nature and we should do what he says. But the problem is, of course, you have to have faith that God exists, that he has a moral nature, and that he actually said the things that your Muslim leaders are actually claiming that he said. That's a lot of faith, none of which has any evidence for it, right? And of course, Islam is hugely divided in terms of what its views on morality are, and has evolved over time as to what its moral views are, just as Christianity has, right? So that should really tell you right there that it's not coming from God. When we retool our moralities, we're retooling them in light of evidence. We see the effects of our moralities on people, and then we see the effects on ourselves as what sort of people we're becoming when we act this way. And then we realize, you know what, we don't want to be that, but I don't want to be that person. I don't want to be like that. And then you morally reform, and then you see this reform spread, and then it becomes cultural and so on. The fact that this changes over time and none of it is found in the Bible or the Quran or anything like that tells you that there's no God, right? Because if God existed, he would have been giving the same correct moral commandments from the beginning to all religions all over the world. And we would have records of this. We'd be able to prove this. So there wouldn't be slavery in the Bible. It would be condemned. Slavery would be condemned in the Bible, right? And it would be the only culture outright condemning slavery, right? But if God existed, all cultures would condemn slavery. It would be remarkable. Like, why do all these cultures from the beginning have the same moralities? They're all like relying on their intuition to get the same knowledge from somewhere, right? That would maybe be evidence for God, but that's not what we get. We get this sort of random hodgepodge of terrible moral systems that we slowly perfect over thousands of years. And by the time we finally got a halfway decent moral system, which is, we're looking at the 20th century, by the time that we're way past all of the religious holy texts, and we've blown them away. They're old news now. They're just a fossil of our bad ideas from 2,000 years ago.
And maybe this is a good time now to examine morality within scientific context, because fixed morality that comes from objective fixed morality versus one that changes with time based on your experience and the information coming in. So in philosophy, you've got the three compartments, the clear ones, ontology, epistemology, and axiology. And it's always been said, well, ontology is one of those areas that, the ivory towers of the philosophers, where you can talk until the cows come home. There's very little to prove here. Epistemology is evidently one that we can practically use. The philosophers 2,500 years ago have done the best with the brains they've got, but that was the tool available. And axiology, where ethics resides. And David Hume's most famously said, you cannot get aught from his. Now,
that's actually not true. David Hume did not say that. And I really need to dispel this urban legend. Yeah. No, Hume never said that phrase, first of all. What he did say is he says that the priests who claim to get an ought from an is aren't showing him how they do it. So he didn't say you couldn't do it. He was just saying that they weren't doing it. And then immediately after he says that, he goes on to do it himself. And he comes up with his theory of, social theory of moral sentiments, where he's driving an ought from an is. So he clearly doesn't think you can't do it. He just says you have to actually do it. You can't just like go around and say, you know, this, therefore that. I was like, I don't see the connection between A and B. And that's exactly the case. Like, this is what we're talking about. Where, well, God says you have to behave this way. And it's like that, you can't get the conclusion from that premise. How do we get the ought out of that is? It doesn't work. You got to do it some other way. Now, Hume never analyzed the actual foundation of ought language, imperative language. He just sort of intuitively did it. And I think it was Philip of Foot who I think was the first to actually articulate. Well, technically, Immanuel Kant was the first to articulate this. Foot is the one who actually shows that Kant was just, you know, his attempt to create two different versions of imperative language was bogus. But he's the first to actually do an analytical study of what does ought language mean. And to make this the simplest thing is a hypothetical imperative is if you want outcome A, then you ought to engage in behavior B. And it's simply a consequential argument that the best way to achieve a certain thing is this certain behavior. So if you want that thing, you have to do that behavior. And a way to really translate the word ought into another sentence would be what you ought to do is what you would do if you were reasoning rationally and had all the correct facts of the matter. And if you want to go from subjunctive to indicative, it is what you will do when you are reasoning without fallacy from true facts about the matter. And that's all that ought is. When you say you ought to do something, you're really just saying you would agree with me that this is the best course of action if you understood all of the reasons for why you ought to do this. But people will skip all of that and say, well, I'm just saying you ought to do it and you should just listen to me. And that's where you get things like David Hume and the ancient Greeks saying, well, sorry, you need to like connect A to B there. You got to like show why it's best for us to do that, engage in that behavior. You have to get the ought from the is. It's not that you can't do it, but you do have to do the hard work of actually doing it. And a good example of in hypothetical imperatives, even Kant admitted that those were getting an ought from an is. A good one is like surgery. If a surgeon wants to save a heart patient, he ought to sterilize his instruments. Everybody agrees that's true, and everybody agrees that its truth comes from two facts, two ises. One is about the facts about germs and sterilization of instruments. And the other fact is about what is the actual goal of the surgeon, right? So then that is a fact of the matter. Like what the surgeon actually wants to accomplish is a fact. And what actually will accomplish that is a fact. So you get the ought from the is. So a surgeon ought to sterilize his instruments. And so that's how you get an ought from an is. And morality is just the same thing. The only difference being is that because morality consists of those imperatives that ought to supersede all other imperatives, morality derives from the goal that supersedes all other goals. And that's when you get down, that's what Aristotle did. Aristotle figured this out already over 2,000 years ago. He said like, well, look, you can talk about the things that you want, but you look at it, you ask, why do you want those things? And there's usually some reason, like you want one thing to get another thing. You want money so that you can live comfortably, or, you know, there's always, you want to work because you want to make money so that you can live comfortably. There's always a reason. And he says, well, if you keep interrogating these things and you get down to it, what is the one thing for which you do everything else, but you don't do for any other reason? You do only for itself. And he called it eudaimonia, which is sometimes gets translated as happiness. I think that's kind of a mistranslation. Eudaimonia literally means good spirit, and it has more to do with satisfaction. I think satisfaction is a better word. When you are satisfied with who you are and how you're living, that's eudaimonia. And so Aristotle says like morality is about getting to that, because you would not trade that for anything else, like nothing else. Like you would not want to be dissatisfied and super wealthy if you had the option to be poor and satisfied. Like if that option was available, you would choose it. Like if you really understood the facts of the matter, you really could compare the two lives. And so that's why satisfaction, life satisfaction and personal satisfaction is the supreme goal that supersedes all other goals. And that's why morality derives therefrom. And this, if people want to see the syllogistic argument, the peer-reviewed argument for this, I have that in The End of Christianity, which is the edited volume by John Loftus. That's where I make this case. But I talk about it in a lot of articles on my blog as well.
So if is redefined as your epistemology, your knowledge, your science, the information that comes in, it becomes almost imperative for you to get to the ought. It's like you cannot get to the ought without going through it. But you have to redefine is in the right way.
Well, yeah, and that's true. It's always true. It's even true for Christians, right? So even when they're arguing that you ought to behave a certain way, what is the is behind all that? well, God exists and he's going to punish you if you don't, or God exists and you're going to get paradise if you do, or God exists and there'll be no point in your living unless you're living according to his directives or living with his spirit or whatever. There's always an is. There's some sort of is. It's a superstitious is about some spirit being and its properties for which they have no evidence, by which they're deriving their op. So even they agree that they're getting an op from an is. They're just using a different is. They're doing the same thing the Egyptians did with the pigs, right? They're just making up some sort of weird superstition and putting that into the is. When what we want to do is put actual empirical facts in the is. That's what we want there. We don't want any of the superstitious stuff.
Even if you use pure science of physics without having to get into philosophy or morality, and if alt is the hypothetical future, how can you get to, because of the arrow of time, you cannot get to the hypothetical future until you pass the present moment, which is the is. And the learnings that come from it. So it's just, it's quite, I've never agreed with that. But then it's all about the definitions of words and what do you mean by certain things.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, if is a state of ignorance where there is absolutely no knowledge achieved whatsoever. Yes, I can understand there might be a barrier, but if is a state of trying to acquire knowledge in order to do better, then it's done.
Right.
You go through it.
It's the answer to every question. Why ought I do that? As soon as you start answering that question with anything that makes any logical sense, you're going to notice it's a bunch of fact claims. And for Christians, the fact claims are fact claims about the spirit being. For non-Christians, for atheists, it's facts about the natural world. We'll talk about game theory. We'll talk about social psychology. We'll talk about anthropology, about political science, economics, right? We'll talk about actual facts and not supernatural stuff.
So in this case here, epistemology and axiology can work together. Sam Harris,
they must. They're inseparable, right? I think, and this actually ties in. You mentioned ontology as the sort of ivory tower thing, but that's actually a historical consequence of the fact that we've actually empirically nailed most ontology. We just call it physics, right? We call it the sciences. So we've just answered most ontological questions with empiricism. And what you find philosophers debating in the ivory tower is just the weird shit that's left over that we haven't answered yet, right? And so eventually we're going to answer that stuff with science too. So so even ontology is empirical. So like the epistemology affects ontology as well as axiology. And I've shown that you can draw the circle in every direction. So like axiology also affects epistemology because there are certain kinds of tests and experiments that would be immoral to do, right? So your epistemology even is limited by axiology. It's a feedback loop. And the same, and ontology ties right in because the ought comes from an is. So the ontology of the world matters in terms of what should morally be done. So it all integrates, and that's why I think it's a great travesty.
Unless you're ontologically Platonic, and then the reality is there's a barrier. You can't. It's not
which is useless, right? No, that's terrible. And I think one of the biggest travesties of philosophy is they've abandoned system building. They've abandoned worldview building as a goal of philosophy. Now everybody just looks for hyper-specific sub-problems, and no one's actually looking at the big picture and saying how do these fields and conclusions even integrate to a single coherent worldview? We used to do that. Academic philosophy is not doing it anymore. I mean, I'm doing it, and I've published in this subject, but most academic philosophers aren't doing it, and they need to get back to doing it because this puts guardrails on what you can do. Because once you realize that it's all related, once you realize it's all related, you can't do one thing and ignore the other. There we go. Sorry.
I don't like to say bless you. I prefer Gesundheit.
Gesundheit, yes, good health.
Yeah. Well, we've got 5 minutes to cover the last piece of the puzzle of today's conversation. And then if you don't mind, Richard, we'll just open up for just a brief 15-20 minutes for general questions. So folks, prepare your questions within 5 minutes. We're going to take them, and Dr. Carrier is going to answer them. Now, obviously, science is one of the tools of epistemology, well, the tool right now we've got. Can it then inform issues of morality? Because it's been said somehow, because science is seen to be cold and detached, and for some reason, ethics is an area where, again, conflated with compassion and being well-hearted and well-intentioned and all that sort of stuff, and science is seen as cold and detached, as if the two shouldn't be working together to do better in society. But I actually argue against that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I agree with you on that. I mean, in one sense, that's a false caricature of science, but in another sense, there is some truth to that. The idea of trying to be overly objective and not offend people, right? So science will tend to avoid subjects that it thinks will be overly controversial. It shouldn't do that, and sometimes it doesn't do that, and it gets us really interesting results. So that's just sort of an arbitrary judgment about how to conduct science. I think obviously science could answer these questions and is already doing so in sort of covert ways. So there is an entire developed field of moral psychology. I highly recommend, there's a 5-volume series on this called Moral Psychology, edited by the philosopher Walter Sinnott Armstrong. Really good example of summary. It summarizes the science from many different angles. Now, they're analyzing it for a lot of different angles. They never sit down and try to say what is the moral truth, because they know that'd be too controversial, right? Like, there would be too much pushback, and there's not enough investment in the research that would be required to nail down the answer that way, right? So if you want to use science to say what is moral, you better be right? You can't just do this stuff that like you see in psychology, where you have these like crappy 100 patient case studies with shitty statistics, and it's like, you can't have that crap. You would need like really, really strong, solid scientific evidence for whatever you're claiming. And that costs money. It's really expensive to do really high-powered, broad studies like this. And no one wants to put the money in because, first of all, the people like who would really put the money in, like Christians, are afraid that they won't get the results that they want, right? You can't do that, right? Science has to be open-minded. You get the results that you get. That's it. So the people who want this stuff don't want to pay for it, and the people who won't pay for it are the people who don't think that it can be done, right? And so I think there's just not enough monetary investment, and there's not a research program that's been developed for how you would do this. And I try to build one. I spell one out in my book, Sense and Goodness Without God. I talk about what would a scientific program look like. But you have to fund it, right? Like, you can't just wish it into existence. And I do think we should do this. I think it would be, we got late to a lot of sciences. Like, psychology is a really young science. We didn't get there. And so we're still not really as good at psychology as we are at physics, for example, right? And part of that is because it's underfunded. Again, like we have these low-powered, underfunded studies get us shitty results, and rather than putting a lot of money into it and getting good results. Which we do sometimes. So there are good results of psychology. It's just there's a lot of crap psychology as well.
You see, psychiatry and neurology will argue psychology is not even real science.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. But you'll see, look at the history. What did it start with? You see, the first real scientific psychology is Freud, and most of that's bogus now. It started out really crappily, right? And then you get to the subsequent, you get like behavioralism, and then okay, well, that was an advancement, but kind of in the wrong direction. We can use some of that stuff, but we need to build it out. We need more of the neuroanalysis, but we need to find some sort of empirical way to do that. And so you see, psychology has grown in the last 100 years, and it has been 100 years, right? So we're talking Freud in the 20s to today. It's advanced a lot, but it started really weak. But you have to start that way. You have to start out as kind of like a little shaky, and then it's going to take decades, if not a century, to even get anywhere that's halfway decent. And when you're talking about something like morality, people are really afraid of the consequences of doing that. Like, do we really want to fund a shitty moral science? Can people be patient enough and wise enough to wait the 100 years of spending and experiments and studies before we can actually say that we confidently know something?
I remember
that's the biggest barrier to this.
It was a bit in The Simpsons. One of the news readers in The Simpsons, he said, "We spent $2 billion to find out whether bees think," and the answer is no. That was the piece, the news piece. So funding a scientific study to find out the IQ differences between ethnic groups might be asking for trouble, eh?
Well, that's a good example. It's a good example because it's actually been done, right? So we have tons of this. We have lots of studies on some of them are really poor, some of them are halfway decent. And I actually write about this. So people who are interested in it, I can't remember what article I do, but if you go searching my blog for the bell curve, that's the infamous book on this subject.
Yes.
I've written on this, and much of ink has been spilled on the bell curve. But the key thing that almost all critics miss is that what the authors of the bell curve did is they tried to look at all the studies and all this data about ethnic differences in IQ. And they understood that you have to control for things. So, you have to control for poverty, and you have to control for this, and you have to control for that, and you have to control for amount of education and things like that. And so they try to think of all the things they have to control for. They control for them all, and what they end up with is a difference in IQ between Black Americans and white Americans of only 5 points. Now, if anybody knows how IQ statistics are run,
that's very little.
5 points is below the margin of error, right? So that is literally an insignificant difference in IQ. It's a non-result, essentially, right? Because IQ tests have a margin of error plus minus 8. I know this because I took 2 IQ tests a long time ago, and my scores varied by 10. My scores. I differed from myself in IQ.
And it depends on what test I've done. I've tried the Mensa in Canada, New Zealand, Australia. They have different...
Right. Yeah. Exactly. And I mean, the ideal of IQ tests is that they should all get the same results, and they don't. But they get close, right? So, and there are studies of this, right? The studies of I can't remember. There's a term for it, but like how accurate are IQ tests when you compare them to each other, things like that. Like, so there's a science of that too. But the result is the bell curve got a non-result, and then they tried to push it as a result. Like, oh, look, 5 points. Can't explain that. But then, of course, people who do notice this go in and like, well, actually, you left out some things you didn't control for. Like they didn't control for neighborhood. And this is crucial because lead poisoning is one of the leading causes of low IQ. And lead poisoning is highly correlated with poverty. So they controlled for poverty. But there can be people who aren't correlating, their poverty level doesn't correlate with the statistic, but they're still living in a neighborhood that's been hit by poverty and has a high lead levels. And so they left out a bunch of things to control for. And if the end result, they got down to only 5 IQ point differences and they left things out and say, when you put those things in, I'll bet those 5 points even disappeared, right? Like once you start taking into account lead exposure, when you start taking about all of these different things that they didn't control for, even that 5 points goes away. And I think this is a valuable result because it actually refutes the racist narrative. So even though they were pushing the racist narrative, trying to prove that Black people were dumber than white people, they ended up actually disproving it, and with that, and didn't say that, like they just lied about what the results meant, hoping people didn't understand how math worked. But it's still, the empirical results were a good thing in the long run because we actually ended up finding this result.
My argument is, even if the test revealed differences and they are significant, let's say 20 points,
which they do before you control for poverty, etc. Right? So. Yeah.
I don't think that should change anything because that's what the fear is. The fear is, what are you going to do as a result?
Exactly.
I'm going to argue that a world population of 160 IQ points in every single, nothing will ever get done. Ever. Like, really sitting here thinking.
Well, it's worth to, like, comedy aside, it's worth taking into account, like, what even is the difference, right? So 5 points is meaningless because it's below the margin of error even. But even if you found 10 points of difference, that would only be slightly above the margin of error. But the actual difference in operational behavioral outcomes is going to be very minor. And then there's the added problem. Of course, like you said, it's the fear, right? The fear is racists would use that data result to argue for all these stupid racist policies. And then smart anti-racists will say, like, well, even if, let's take a hypothetical. Let's suppose this aliens crash landed on Earth, and it's like District 9. Have you seen that movie?
Oh yeah, the South African or?
Yeah, the aliens crashed in South Africa. And let's suppose these aliens were actually dumb. They were the dumb workers. They were actually bred to have low IQ, but not like catastrophically low IQ, just mildly lower than the average human. Would that justify any of the shit we did to them in District 9? No, not at all, right? Like their dignity as people, their autonomy, their competency as adults, and so on, would all be equally valued. So their the way we should treat them morally should be not at all different, right? So yes, you're right. Even getting that result, even if we gotten a result of some sort of racial differences in IQ, it shouldn't change anything. But you're right that people have this knee-jerk fear that it will change things, and that can lead to serious wariness when people start actually doing those kinds of studies. I don't think we should be afraid of those things. I think we should do them because I think in the end result, it's going to end either prove us wrong, which we should want to know, or it's going to prove us right, which we would want. We want that result. So
I think this requires it will require certain human maturity. I think we've got a long way to mature into thinking differently. And we're hitting there, animal rights and we're getting better at things. And
it's like global warming, right? The trends go up and down and up and down, but the trend line is up. And this has been established. Steven Pinker wrote a book about this. He did Better Angels of Our Nature, and Shermer did The Moral Arc. And both of them are right in the general point, which is that we actually, for the ups and downs, we've had the advances and backlashes and so on. But if you look at the overall trend line over decades and centuries, we have made moral progress, and even to this day, and we're still doing it. I don't think people should be afraid of that. I think people should welcome it.
Brilliant. Now it's time for questions. I'm just going to look in the chat. I think there are a few here that we can tackle straight away.
Mm-hmm.
I guess you've got a few books you wrote yourself, Richard, to recommend.
Oh, yeah. Well, people who want to read anything from me or about me, richardcarrier.info. So just my name, richardcarrier.info. That's my website. Has everything you need there, including all my books. You can go buy books and go see all the books I've written or contributed to. I've also contributed chapters to many anthologies.
Brilliant. And in the description of this video, guys, all the information to do with Richard, website information, and a bit of a bio as well in there. So please make sure to visit the site and have a look at the books he wrote about morality and other interesting topics. Why, oh God, not to be obligated to give us comprehensive evidence for its existence?
I love the convoluted sentence there. Yeah, I can't even parse that. Okay. It does raise an interesting question about the epistemic morality, right? The morality of belief formation. Are we morally obligated to be critical thinkers? And the answer is yes. The difficult part is convincing someone to actually admit what a critical thinker is and then to actually live that way. Because you can agree on the moral question, but not epistemically realize that you're failing at it. But with regard to God, it would depend. So I think the way I put it, like if God morally governed the universe, and designed it morally, like if the universe wasn't completely fucked up like it actually is, then we wouldn't need him to prove his existence, right? He's just, hey, I'm taking care of business. You don't need to know I exist. Doesn't matter. Like if you want to believe me, that's fine. So in that, there's no obligation then. The reason the obligation arises is because this is how the conversation goes. We go, look, the world's completely horribly designed. It's completely fucked up. Nobody's governing it. Humans are the only ones that do anything morally responsible around here. So your God doesn't exist. And then they'll come back and go, oh, no. God has some sort of elaborate reason to make everything so shitty and not govern anything and not do anything. And you go, well, then he'd be morally obligated to tell us. and that's, it's because the world doesn't look like a world with God in it, that will create the moral obligation that it's like if I have to barrel through a crowd of people in a car and kill people, for some reason I have to do this. There's some morally justifiable reason for it. I'm not even going to try and think of a reason. Let's just say there is. Yes, I would be morally obligated to explain why the fuck I did that, right? You can't say he doesn't need to explain it. Just trust him. He's a good guy. Yeah. No, God's the same way. So it's only the evils that God allows that create a moral obligation on him to explain why the hell he's doing that. Because we can't figure out any obvious reason or any justifiable reason why. And if we're supposed to follow him, we're supposed to worship him, we need evidence that he's someone worthy of worship. so far, I'm not seeing a good show of evidence that he's the sort of person who's worthy of worship. So he would have to explain himself. As the Greeks would say, you got to show it to me. You got to give me some evidence. I'm not going to just take you on your word. And so that's what creates the sort of moral obligation to speak. But whereas if God actually did things like a moral God, he wouldn't need to prove he existed, because he would have nothing to prove. He wouldn't have to prove himself. He would just already be doing everything he's supposed to be doing. So that's my perspective.
Always thought of the two problems put against the existence of God, the problem of suffering. I don't like to call it problem of evil.
And to be fair, Brierley also calls it the problem of suffering.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so he doesn't. He does have like a paragraph or two on the sort of, well, you can't call it bad without moral standards, and you can't have moral standards without God, which is kind of the same trick that they play with the word evil. Well, you can't call it evil if there's no God. It's like, well, you're just playing semantics with the word evil. That you're not saying evil in the sense that we mean it. That's why suffering bypasses that problem. And so it is good that Brierley like confronts that from the title on. It's like, I'm just going to call it suffering and not try to make the problem go away that way.
Yeah, that one is more, to me, it's slightly the emotional one. The one that is very, to me, it's the intellectual and the stronger of the two cases is the non-resistant non-belief, the problem of divine hiddenness. That's just the syllogism is strong, and it doesn't leave you without a God, but at least a God worthy of worshipping, because
right. And to reiterate, like that only becomes a problem because of how poorly governed and poorly designed the world is. If the world, of course, in a sense, if the world was well governed and well designed, that in itself would be decisive evidence of a benevolent creator and so on. So I guess, it's catch-22. Like he proves he exists or he's shitty. Like he doesn't have even a choice really. But still, divine hiddenness is really only a problem because of the poor design and organization of the world.
So this is to do with the Roe versus Wade, the late-term abortion rights.
So a lot of people don't understand what's actually in Roe v. Wade. I highly recommend it. And the short answer is yes, I think the Roe v. Wade decision should be made law, should be made federal law. Now, that is not going to be a comfort to everybody, and I'll explain why. And I recommend people read Roe v. Wade. It's one of the best. There's some of the best philosophy comes from the Supreme Court sometimes. And this is one of them, the Roe v. Wade decision. It's really long. It goes into the history of abortion laws and sentiments about abortion. It goes into the biblical stuff, the Talmudic stuff. It goes into the history of laws. It does a total Aristotle. There's a total Aristotle on the abortion question. Like it's practically something that Aristotle could have written himself, but updated to modern skills and citation methods and stuff. But the end result of the Roe v. Wade decision was the three-part system based on trimesters. The first trimester, the government has absolutely no business getting involved. That's a total privacy issue. The right to privacy supersedes the government's interest. The government can't do anything. The second trimester, the government has an interest in regulating abortion for the safety of people seeking abortions. So the government has an obligation to say, well, if you're going to go get abortions, we can make sure that they're going to be safe and not kill too many mothers and so on. And then on the third trimester, the court said, like in the ruling says, the government does have an interest if it wants to show an interest in protecting the fetus. So it can actually prioritize the fetus over the mother, except in self-defense, which would be like medical necessity. So if the fetus is going to kill you, then you get to kill it. Then it's moral, right? So the idea there is that if you elect, basically Roe v. Wade gave the foundation to outlaw elective third trimester abortion. It's very explicit on this. It doesn't leave a waffle room. No elective abortions. Now, it doesn't say that you can't do it. It just says that you could pass a law that does this. And most people didn't. So there weren't a lot of laws actually passed using Roe v. Wade as a justification for banning elective third trimester abortions. And what we usually get is they try to push when they do pass these laws, they push it way outside of their trimester. So they're violating Roe v. Wade. And they outlaw even medically necessary elective abortion. So they violate Roe v. Wade. But any law that said in the United States, today, we're going to outlaw elective third trimester abortions, you could not knock that law down by citing Roe v. Wade, because Roe v. Wade completely authorizes those laws. So that's the legal situation. From a moral science perspective, I agree with that. And I think that's a decision. Now, there's a lot of ambiguity as to the status of a fetus in the third trimester. But there's no ambiguity before the third trimester. There's absolutely no chance of any personal consciousness in a second trimester fetus. It's physically impossible. So there's no question there. In the third trimester, some point in there, you're getting to a baby, right? And so if society wants to ban elective third trimester abortions, I would completely support that. I wouldn't see any reason to oppose it. But of course, I think a lot of other structural things have to happen. I think, if you're going to have someone not even be able to find out if they're pregnant until the third trimester, well, you have a huge social systemic problem then, which, by the way, a national healthcare service would solve, right? So I think I would love to trade with abortion activists and say, I'll tell you what, we will ban all elective third trimester abortions if you give me national health care. Right? Or even better, if you give me free IUDs for all teenagers, for all women, actually, any woman who wants one, they get a free IUD, which incidentally, ironically, would have a huge impact. It would actually reduce abortions more than any law that you would ever pass. So I would actually be more Christian in terms of ending abortion by promoting free IUDs for all women and supporting banning elective third trimester abortion. So that's my take on it. I do think that I don't agree with that it's moral. I think it's morally ambiguous, and I think therefore it should be avoided, elective third trimester abortion. But I also think there's a lot of systemic things that we need to change that would even negate the reason for wanting to have an elective third trimester abortion. There's a lot of stuff about society that could be fixed that I think Christians are neglecting because they're so obsessed with fetuses and don't care at all about families or living people. So actual conscious existing adults. But that's a whole other story.
We're antinatalists, so we start the abortion from a very, very early stage.
I'm not an antinatalist.
Now, the final thoughts on this one here. Now we've realized that we're moral agents. Morality's evolved with us. It's something that it's a moving target. We keep sort of probing and understanding. And as science getting in, we're getting to understand a lot more knowledge about the things that we're engaging with. We're refining our stance. What is the future of morality, especially in view of the advancement of sciences and how brave some endeavors are going to look like in the future?
Yeah.
What's the landscape going to look like?
That's a good question. It's always controversial to answer this because if society doesn't already agree with the future you're imagining, then obviously they think you're suggesting something horrible, which is exactly what slave owners would have said 100 years ago or 200
eugenics.
Years ago. Yeah. Well, human engineering. Genetic engineering. We don't really have a well-defined morality around it, so that isn't really a good example. A better example is I think monogamy is going to go the way of the dodo. I don't think we can morally justify what I would call compulsory monogamy. Like if you yourself choose, you're not coerced, you're not being pressured, you're not being, you're not giving ultimatums, you're not been given ultimatums, that you just choose yourself. I only want to have one romantic partner. And then you make that choice, that's fine. But at any time you say that someone is supposed to be monogamous, I think that's immoral, actually. I don't think there's any moral basis for that. And I know that's super controversial to say. And so I think, but within 100 years, I think that's going to be one of the frontiers where we're going to start realizing that, it's actually kind of barbaric. We're not going to be monogamous anymore. We can't make that as a moral commandment. And so that's one of the controversial things that I think.
Or actually, Richard, come out and be brave and admit it, because it might be already happening, but behind the scenes.
Oh, it certainly is. Yeah. And we have statistics showing that it's happening more and more. In both senses. So public ethical non-monogamy is way more frequent now than it was 50 years ago. And then at the same time, you have certain people who are public about it, and there's an increasing number of people who are privately doing it. So both are increasing. So we know that societal behaviors are changing. The mores have not entirely shifted all that way yet. They're starting to. You can see the arguments and debates. I still think we have probably 50 years before it becomes the norm to say that monogamy is sort of a weird personal choice and not like a moral requirement.
I can see some fists are being made, and
But
Muslims
that's
say,
an
well,
example of what you're asking.
Muslim says we
Right?
got it right. You know, the four wives thing, we've got it all figured.
You know, it's funny. I had a apartment manager once, and I was explaining to him that I was polyamorous and I have multiple girlfriends. He says, "Oh, that's great." He says, "But no, my wife wouldn't like that." I was like, "Well, you do realize like she gets to do it too." Equality. If you get to have multiple girlfriends, she gets to have multiple boyfriends. That's just obviously right. Like she's the same moral status as you on this. And so yeah, that's the one thing where Islam got it wrong. They still had the sexist, misogynistic men on top scenario. No, everybody gets to do it. Everybody gets to be non-monogamous. That's the future of morality, I think.
This is a funny one that I want to tell you about. That because one of the challenges of the paradise in Islam, that the women don't get a thing, don't get anything.
Yeah.
But there was a fatwa been issued just recently that the females, when they go to heaven, they'll grow a small penis, and actually it says tiny penis, so they can enjoy one huri. That is, I was in stitches. Like, I mean,
there's so many things with that. I don't even know where to start, but okay, yeah.
So,
but that illustrates my point is that this is anything you suggest, any answer you gave to that question is going to be controversial because we haven't gotten there yet, right? But it is valid to say, like, have we reached the pinnacle of morality, or are there still things that we're wrong about that we're going to be right about in the future? And I have a list of these somewhere. I can't remember where I put them. They're on my blog somewhere, right? I do talk about non-monogamy, but where I said some other examples of these kinds of things, I think where the moral direction, we're not where we should be yet, but are heading in that direction. And I just picked non-monogamy because I know it really well. I know this. I know all the literature, the ethical debates, and so on about it. But there are others that you could offer where I think we're not there yet. But we are pretty close. I think we are the most moral society.
Things like capital punishment, you know, I mean, 100 years ago, that was sort of unheard of. And now
right.
We've seen more countries are banning it.
That's right. Yeah,
How many,
right.
Mostly the northern states in the United States are the ones sort of abolished it, but the southern ones still having it.
Right. Yeah. Basically, it correlates with evangelical Christianity. So the more they control the politics, the more they have capital punishment. It's basically how that works. And there was a scientific study done that showed that the more conservative Christianity, well, what they tracked is they tracked belief in hell, right? So if you believe in a hell, and there are lots of liberal Christians don't, they have different views of this, but if you believe in a hell, particularly a punitive hell, and the more people who believe that, the more fucked up their society is by every metric, right? It's the worst society to live in, right? So like if there's only like a certain number of hell believers, then society will be slightly fucked up. But if there's a ton of hell believers, your society is going to be totally fucked up in terms of measures of crime and various other things.
It's to do with retribution. The sentiment of retribution. I think Christopher Hitchens once been told is like, oh, we can understand human beings inventing paradise, but why do you invent hell? And he said, well, that's quite easy. That's for other people to go to. Yeah.
It's coercion. No, it's literally, it was invented to coerce people. So it's like Hammurabi says, the sun god told me all this stuff. And then if people disagreed, he'd go beat them, right? Like that was pretty straightforward. But when you can't just go out and beat everybody who disagrees with you, you have to scare them. And how do you scare them? You come up with, oh, hell, it's going to be really terrible. Like, I can't beat you, but trust me, God's going to beat you pretty hard later, right? Like you're trying to put the fear of God into people to get them to conform to whatever morality you're pushing. And generally you find that the religions who have moralities that are the least, they're falling out of popularity, right? Those are the ones that become more strict about their hell belief because they're trying harder and harder to scare people to adhere to their religion. Whereas the more humane religions don't need to scare people to adhere to their religions.
And this is our final question of the day. When does Richard think an atheist can successfully run for office?
Well, it's already happened. Well, okay, run for office. That's an important distinction.
Don't say it was Trump, please.
Yeah. No, we've actually had a few members of United States Congress who were out atheists, but they outed themselves as atheists after they were elected. So it's important to note, like, that's an important point. Like, can you run as an open atheist. And I don't think anybody could get elected to the US Congress today. You probably could get elected to certain state legislatures. I'll bet you could get into the California legislature as an open atheist. There might even already be people who qualify. I haven't checked, right? But let's stick with the US Congress. You probably couldn't get elected there as an open atheist yet. Could you do it in the future? Yeah, I think so. I would guess, looking at the statistical trends, 2 more generations, so about 50 years.
Sorry, Richard, why couldn't you? Because something constitutional, or is it because of the?
No. There's no. In fact, the Constitution mandates that you're allowed to run for office as an atheist. So that's there actually were some laws that banned state legislative runs if you're an atheist, but those were ruled unconstitutional. So those laws might technically be on the books, but they're unenforceable. Mm-hmm. But anyway, no, there's no law against it. There's nothing against that. No, it's just it's so hard to get elected. You have to build coalitions of voters that there's no way to do. So we're about 80% Christian, right? So there's no way to get elected, even in like the most liberal counties. They're still majority Christian. So there's no way to get elected without getting a substantial number of Christians to vote for you. And so it's really, really hard, rhetorically speaking, to convince Christians to vote for an atheist. Even liberal Christians are a little icky about it, and conservative Christians are super icky about it. And so that's the problem. That's the barrier, is the social bigotry and hostility towards the idea, the myths about atheists and so on. And then there's also just basically political economics, which is any candidate who runs is going to have a certain number of liabilities that he can be attacked on, that he or she can be hit on. And then they have to spend a certain number of resources to defend themselves on those things, whatever their exposures are. Adding atheism is just one more thing that makes it more expensive to run, because it's one more thing you have to spend money and time defending. And this is all because we're so Christian here. The United States is weirdly more Christian than most first world countries.
So do you think, Richard, the man to your right could have been hiding something?
The who? What?
The man to your right.
Maybe.
Sometimes, yeah.
So I've listened to some of his theological stuff. Like, he actually has done speeches in a church mindset. And so like I suspect even Martin Luther King Jr. might have been really like he might not have been a sincere believer, but Obama has a similar mindset, which is religion. It's very Confucian, actually. This is very much like Confucius. The idea is that religion has an important social function, and you can use all your religious language metaphorically and still be telling the truth, right? So you can look at this and look very carefully for the things they don't say, and the things they do say. And you say, like, look at anything that even Martin Luther King Jr., anything he ever said about social justice, like literally, like any speech, and you can say, like, you could take God out of it, and the arguments are still solid, right? Like, he never like says because God therefore, right? Like, that doesn't happen. And there's no discussion of like, well, heaven, and like that's like, he talks about these things, but they're not forms of his persuasive argument. Like, he's not trying to persuade people with that information. Obama's the same way. Like, he'll talk about social justice and what Jesus said and all of this stuff, but it's all framed in the same way that you would have a Roman senator come up and talk about, well, Homer wrote about, like it's not like you don't have to believe the truth of it to believe that the premises that are being advanced in the
almost like quoting Socrates.
Yeah. So I think for Obama, I think he definitely sees Christianity as a social tool, but he's not cynical about it, in the sense that, like, he's not like the neoconservatives who think, well, they're really atheists, but we have to be like Plato said, we have to pretend we're religious to control the stupid masses. And yeah, we can't tell them God doesn't exist because they're stupid, and we have to control them with their God belief and stuff. And that's sort of the cynical secret atheist. That's on the conservative side. In the liberal side, it's not, no, they're completely accepting of someone being a genuine believer. Like, yeah, like, you might actually be true. Like, myself personally, I don't know. But you have your belief, and that's great. I totally respect that. But let me talk to you in terms that you understand. And so let me talk about what Jesus says. Let me talk about what your theology says, and so on. And so it sounds like, you could be like Obama and say, so that you sound like you're a Christian, and you do agree with all of the sort of stuff in terms of its actual meaning. but you never have to actually defend the literal truth of any of it, right? And so when that happens, when I see someone doing that, I can't say for sure that that is sort of clue that they're actually an atheist and that they're putting on a Christian pose, because I think it's socially convenient to do it. But it is an available possibility. It actually matches the evidence, right? So I can't say whether Obama is really an atheist or not. But from everything I've heard from him, he easily could be, but he could still also have like a sincere understanding, a liberal understanding of theology.
What about Trump? Because he couldn't.
No, he's a total atheist. Yeah, yeah. He can't possibly believe in God at all. No. I'm fairly certain that he's just a sociopath who believes whatever is convenient at the moment, basically.
Yeah, but I was going to say, even if he's an atheist, it's not on intellectual grounds.
No, exactly. No, absolutely. Yeah. Can I make money on it? Nope. I don't care.
This was fun. I hope everybody enjoyed the conversation. I think morality is a lot more clear for me, having talked to the great Richard Carrier. Thank you so much for the conversation. And I'm thinking of tackling free will at some point. So,
well, I know a lot about that subject too. Yeah.
Brilliant. Any final words, Richard?
Yeah, I would just say, like, we've talked about the meta ethics and things a lot, but we've never really like outright said what is and isn't moral. And I would just say, like, the three virtues that I think are the most fundamental are compassion, which is just empathy, honesty, which is just sincerity, and reasonableness, right? Being a reasonable person, I think, is a moral directive as well. And I think anyone who lives by those three values and does it in light of the true facts of the world, like you endeavor with your epistemology to find out what is really true, form true beliefs of the world is to the extent that you can, and then act on those beliefs based on compassion, honesty, and reasonableness, and you will have a better life. Statistically, more likely that you'll end up better off. Personally, with yourself, you'll end up more right with yourself. You'll end up more right with your community, and the society will be better to live in. And certainly, if everybody iterates that behavior and acted that way, the society would be great. You'd be much better off in such a society if everybody lived that way. And I think that's the ultimate moral message. And we can show that that is empirically, factually the case, that this isn't just pie in the sky.
Thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to see you next month again in another installment of one of our conversations. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. I'll see you later.